Yeah, you're welcome to this class, and I hope you've been enjoying so far what we've been doing on this channel. Well, I'll encourage you to invite people to check this. Well, I'll advise you to make this, global, so that, more people will be able to enjoy what we are doing here. Now, today we are looking at poetry. Mind you, in our treatment of poetry, we will be looking at the genre in the first instance, but we'll also be interested in looking at poetry as the poetic, something you find in almost any situation that language is used. Now, poetry has been with us as far as the moment humanity got involved with language. That means we can say that poetry has always been with human society and has been part of the language of society from one culture to the other, from one time to the other. The value of poetry really is in its rhetorical performance. And the moment that poetry began to have a very deep influence on humanity, we may say, was during those moments when orality was very much part of human cultures than the written. By extension, you somehow found that in the oral times of several cultures, poetry wasn't just something being realized as a linguistic performance. It almost always came up as a dramatic thing. Drama in the broadest sense of the word, in terms of performance, in terms of color, in terms of voicing, in terms of, staging, whatever you might call it, in terms of the suspense, shock, and a number of things that called immediate attention to people, So we can say that poetry takes a kind of premium to a very arguable extent over any other genre of literature we are familiar with today. We may call it the prose fiction or drama, in the sense that it has a kind of functionality that you often discover in daily performances. For example, if you imagine the origin of pithy sayings, the origin of proverbs, the origin of idiomatic expressions, and the ways in which people somehow unconsciously, unpremeditated, just described the other person in highly imagistic terms, in normal language, among children, you'll discover that somehow we may say that poetry had been part of the civilizational processes of language development from one society to the other. But the dramatic essence of poetry, as we find out, especially in the way its language comes up, may be said to be part of how society developed culturally and artistically, especially when we imagine how much the language is very much colorful, that is inviting to the audience that is listening to it, and how somehow it takes us to realms of, imaginative suspense. So that when we talk about poetry in oral times, it often got fused with music, with drama, with staging, and so many other things. So that we can say that to a very great extent, poetry was probably or arguably part of human language, either in the conscious or in the unconscious. So to write poetry would be something quite demanding in the area of reproducing such functionalities on paper. Let me go a little bit further to say that of the known genres of literature we are familiar with, poetry distinguishes itself as not just a way in which literature communicates, a way in which literature, gives an opinion, a way in which literature sensitizes. Poetry is not just thematic, it's not just subject matter oriented, even though definitely you always find that very much a necessary property of poetry, just like any other genre at all. But then one thing that particularly distinguishes poetry from the other known genres is this. Apart from how it gives a rhetorical power to the language it produces, it actually invites you to its language. Poetry's language is inviting. It has an invitational essence, which makes the reason for its rhetorical presence, its rhetorical immediacy when people engage it, either as the writer or as the audience. So that when we talk about writing poetry, we are involved in a number of things that initially demand a deep imaginative orbit within our brains. And to a very great extent too, we can argue again, because all these things are subject to argumentations, but somehow, let's check this out, that poetry, when it is produced, when it comes out to the area where the audience is such that it tends to transport our minds away from ourselves. You may just put it that way. Any worthy poem at all that comes up immediately arrests audience attention. And why is that? Number one, it is a very rhetorical, imaginative rendition. Number two, it has all the things that can sensitize people within society, like music. To a very great extent, it has the property of music. Well, I'm talking about a very, very compelling form of poetry. It has a very compelling way in which it draws attention to certain kinds of artistry that you may say don't immediately belong to poetry. For example, you have the musical in poetry to a very great extent. You have the theatrical in poetry to a very great extent. You have the artistic, you have the graphic in poetry. In fact, it's a kind of poetry that is called concrete poetry. That poetry is done in a graphic manner. For example, if you were to talk about key, an object like the key, you're most likely going to discover that the graphic view of the key is going to populate what you are reading. If you are talking about an apple, somebody just wants to give a kind of concrete poetry of an apple, you are most likely going to find the poetry in form of an artistically drawn apple, and the whole thing somehow has a synthesis. Language and graphics seem to have synthesis, so that there is that materiality and the linguistics of what the poem is doing. So we can say that poetry navigates all kinds of modes, can be rendered in all forms of media, and it has an immediacy that makes it very functional within human society. And that's why poetry is somehow very, very peculiar, very, very special in the way in which it draws immediate attention. Its material property of language and, performance is inviting on its own. For example, let me put it this way. If you were to pick a short story or you pick a novel and you start reading from the first page and you go on, you go gradually into a particular story. It pulls you gradually into it, just like poetry does as well in some instances. But then the difference between that short story, however short and however diverting, the difference between it and poetry is that while it takes us into a gradual journey, poetry can keep leaping us into journeys from one line to the other because of the way its language is peculiar. Remember, if you have been on this channel, we talked about the formalist thoughts of literature. One thing about formalist ideas of poetry is that it defamiliarizes. If you are talking about a genre that hangs on defamiliarization, that is, using language in such a way that goes away from how it's done on normal daily cultural basis or societal basis, you are talking about poetry. Why do we need to look at poetry? Why do we need to study poetry? Basically, for one major reason, because of its functionality. We can describe poetry in the following ways. Number one, it is a linguistic activity of art that says little and achieves much. Poetry can talk about so much, but it can be so economical with language. Even if it's epic, even if it goes on, it's a narrative thing that keeps going on and winding. Imagine what your idea of writing an epic would be like if you were to take that into actually meaning to write a novel. Most predictably, you are going to have something more voluminous, writing in prose, writing the novel. But then it's very rare to find a poet going on an epic journey, going, from one page to the other, talking about events and looking it up. Yeah, that happens, and that is very legendary. But then one basic thing that has marked poetry out is that it often doesn't go so long when it's talking about a subject matter. A poem definitely can go for pages, but it's not a peculiarity of poetry. Something about poetry is that it often says so much by the activity, by the collocation, the coherence of language, of words in a little space of rendition. And when that happens, you find out that by the time the reader is through with what they are reading, you might be suspended into a realm that takes you out of yourself, and you begin to ponder what the poet has just said. It seems to echo. It seems to be immanent in you. It seems to make you daydream at times when you are dealing with a very effective poetry. So poetry can be very, very patterned in such a way that the language comes in few lines or in a short distance kind of volume, but then it says so much. And why is this like that? Number two, the language of poetry is often imagistic. The language of poetry is often such that it brings attention to the scale of something very, very, unexpected, very, very suspenseful, very, very arresting, something very, very enduring, memorable, and something that echoes. So the language of poetry along that line draws attention to itself. Let me put it in this way, just like I have said it some lectures away. There was this poet called Alexander Pope, and he was trying to talk about the achievement of Isaac Newton in terms of how he had discovered the source of electricity and had been able to, make it profitable to humanity, especially the initial humanity of the society of those days when he was living. And then Alexander Pope, I think, overwhelmed by the achievement of the electric light, suspending what had been, occurring in those analphabetic societies, putting on lighting a wick or putting fire within a kind of burner that kept burning all night, and then you switched it up. That, he was very impressed with the achievement of the electricity, the brightness of the electric light, and so on and so forth. That I guess what happened to him was so deep that he found out that the real way to communicate the magic, so to speak, or better still, the miracle of what Isaac Newton had done was to poetize it. Poetry takes a whole lot of imaginative alertness, imaginative condensation to bring about the power of his message. I guess Isaac Newton had been meditating what to write for quite a while. And this, what he was going to write about Isaac Newton, was such that it had to gestate, it had to develop from time to time within the brain of his brain. And then when he was ready to pour out what he had to say about Isaac Newton, he wasn't saying Isaac Newton is the formidable man of our century, is the remarkable historic figure of our race. Isaac Newton should be recorded in human history forever. Yeah, just what I have said can be very riveting as well. Motioning such language that created the importance of Isaac Newton. But you know what he did? He didn't do it that way. He rather poetized it in two evergreen lines. Ever since he wrote that, right from the 17th century up till now, it's still a dream kind of poem. 2 lines. He said, nature and nature's law lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. 2 lines. Nature and nature's law lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Now, look at this. If you're familiar with the Bible, you will know that the actual power of the rhetoric of what he was trying to say was on the second line. What he did was to do some things we are going to talk about very soon. He subverted a particular understood sequence that we found in the language of the Bible, talking about God decreeing, let there be light, in the story of the creation in the Bible. And then he actually does an appropriation of Newton and making Newton, so to speak, personify that very light. Instead of saying, let there be light, he says, God said. God said, let there be light in the Bible. But in this miracle of the electricity, Newton seems to have changed Newton into that very light. And he says, God said, let Newton be, and all was light. The compression of idea, the change of the normal, collocation that we found in the linguistic, line that brings about that performance of light coming from God, is now moved into the persona of Newton. The power of that kind of rhetoric becomes case of arrest, audience arrest, as you call it. So what we are saying is this: if we are going to do poetry of any serious magnitude, language is highly important. The imaginative. Imagination is the creation of something that had never been. Let's put it that way. To imagine is to bring about another world that is not familiar into the world that is familiar, that will literally make the known world suspended in its own wonder. And therefore, poetry is a verbal performance that has a whole lot of rhetorical force that brings about a number of elements in society in a functional way, including music, including the surprise elements of things that happen in society. It brings in suspense, it brings in the shock within an immediacy that literally transports the audience away from their own selves in wonder. However, it still brings them into the powerful essence of what the poet is saying, which makes it a very arresting genre. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked about what Alexander Pope did with 2 lines. And it does that in such a way that the language does not overflow the purpose of what he wants to say, but then in few words, he arrests, so to speak, the wonder of the discovery of electricity. We're continuing with this lecture very soon. Make sure you are with this channel, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like it, and make sure you share this. Thank you very much.